All rise in body or in spirit for the reading of the gospel. It comes to us this week from Matthew, the 21st chapter. Listen to another parable. There was a landowner who planted a vineyard, put a fence around it, dug a wine press in it, and built a watchtower. Then he leased it to tenants and went to another country. When the harvest time had come, he sent his slaves to the tenant to collect his produce. But the tenants seized his slaves and beat one, killed another, and stoned another. Again, he sent other slaves, more than the first, and they treated them in the same way. Finally, he sent his son to them, saying, "They will respect my son." But when the tenants saw the son, they said to themselves, "This is the heir. Come, let us kill him and get his inheritance." So they seized him, threw him out of the vineyard, and killed him. Now, when the owner of the vineyard comes, what will he do to those tenants? They said to him, "He will put those wretches to a miserable death and lease the vineyard to other tenants who will give him the produce at the harvest time." Jesus said to them, "Have you never read in the scriptures, the stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone? This was the Lord's doing, and it is amazing in our eyes. Therefore I tell you, the kingdom of God will be taken away from you and given to a people that produces the fruits of the kingdom. The one who falls on this stone will be broken to pieces, and it will crush anyone on whom it falls." When the chief priests and the Pharisees heard his parables, they realized he was speaking about them. They wanted to arrest him, but they feared the crowds because they regarded him as a prophet. It's the gospel of our Lord. Praise to you, O Christ. 3 weeks of vineyard parables, and I think it's time that we officially talk about what is a biblical vineyard, what does it mean then, what will it mean now? Because it's different, I am sure, than what many of you are imagining in your head. You're thinking of a beautiful chateau and these lines of grapes going down a slope, ending in a river, and generations of people filling the chateau with tapestries. Other than the lines of grapes, no. Because as we hear from our passage here, we've got a fence, a wine press, and a watchtower. Vineyards in ancient Palestine were not really places that people lived. They were more like ancillary properties that were owned by fairly wealthy people and then also leased out, in this case, to a tenant. The tenant, if you're wondering, where's the tenant living? In the watchtower, as a matter of fact. Watchtowers had important roles. They were set up high, especially in the summer months, for 2 reasons. It's actually a little cooler up there. And then they could see. They could look around and see if there were wild animals breaking through, if the fence was in need of repair. If the tenant had a family, which I'm gathering this tenant does have a family, and that's what we're talking about with the tenants, plural, there was usually another abode nearby that they could live in as well. And through the summer months, a tenant could pretty much take care of a vineyard themselves. There was watering to be done, and oftentimes there was some irrigation that happened. There was some lime that needed to be spread on the vines to make it work in this climate. But it was really at the harvest time where the labor needed just totally exceeded what one tenant family could possibly handle. And so what would happen, and this is kind of cool, is the cities would kind of empty out, and people would go out into the countryside. They'd fill up these vineyards. They'd work there for a while. They'd set up little spots for themselves. It was a whole family affair. Families would come in. It was really, really a joyous time. And incidentally, we are in the season of Sukkot with our Jewish brothers and sisters. They are celebrating the festival of booths, where they leave their home to be out in nature communally, celebrating family, celebrating the harvest time, celebrating the change of the season. Here in New England, it's very convenient for us because that's when we start selling pumpkins, a symbol of that change of season too, that often bedeck the Sukkot, where this booth that the people live in. It's a confluence of nature and the world and all the animals that live in it and all the things that happen at this season with the communal and with the family coming together. It's beautiful. Now, within our parable here, there are some things that are specific to this story, metaphorically going on, that we can talk about, that we can kind of tease out of this, now that we know what essentially a biblical vineyard looks like. But I want to be clear about something. You can only really do what I'm about to do with this vineyard even the prior two vineyards, just be a little bit hesitant to take any one-to-one metaphorical connection here and apply it there. Now, the reason why I'm saying that is that while there are a lot of metaphorical links within any parable, this one is perhaps the most transparent. And I think we can do one of the most robust definitions of correlation, one-to-one correlation. Let's start with the landowner. Landowner is God. Not in every parable, but in this parable, the landowner in the vineyard is God. How do we know that? Well, there's an old tradition. This is not the first time we've ever heard of vineyards. There's an old tradition of using vineyards to describe either the people of Israel as a vine in a vineyard, a beautiful nation within many nations, or a vineyard itself. But always, always, always the person planting, preparing, that's God. That's God's work. And we are to know that this is God's land, that our ownership of it is not the same as God's ownership of it. God is the true owner of the land, and incidentally, we live on it. We live at God's pleasure in this land. Now, the important thing to note is that God didn't just do the naturalistic things here. God also created the things that we might have seen in this parable as being man-made. The fence, the winepress, the watchtower. Those are created also by God. And in many ways, they feel like stand-ins for some of the structures that God gave in law. The Ten Commandments and the Deuteronomistic laws and the customs of the people of Israel that have guided them so well through the centuries, that have made them a clarion call of a righteous nation in the midst of some fairly barbarous nations who were willing to do some really awful things. The Jewish people could be, at least in their aspirations, known to be a righteous people. So there's that. The tenants. Well, the tenants. The tenants are pretty evil, aren't they? And indeed, by the end of our story, the chief priests and the Pharisees are able to even identify themselves metaphorically in this story as being the evil tenants. In a second, we're going to talk about why they take issue with that. And I think it goes beyond just the, hey, they're making fun of me thing. But they have been told in this that you behaved poorly. You, for instance, killed the slaves that I sent. Think of all the prophets that were sent to the nation of Israel and in the way that they were not often well received, including very recently John. Think of when we hear the son sent, who the son might represent. Well, pretty clearly, son of the landowner, also killed by these tenants. That's a stand-in for Christ. And the tenants know this. They know that this is wrong. They have been sent here to do what's righteous in the land, and yet here they're doing these awful things. And so the chief priests and Pharisees are saying, hey, this guy's saying that we are doing a bad job of what we were told to do, which is to care for the vineyard. Now, what's the point of this vineyard? Why is this vineyard here? Well, now is when we're going to have to sort of take the ancient and the modern and see what does it mean for us now. So what's the point of a vineyard? Well, the point of a vineyard is to produce fruit and to produce it abundantly, right? Now, you might have had the mistaken notion that this is a luxury good. This is not a luxury good. Basically, the two main staple foods of ancient Palestine are bread and grapes. And grapes, of the two of them, might have been the more essential, because not only can you eat grapes, and they were oftentimes eaten either fresh during this wonderful season of harvest, or they were also dried, where olive oil would be poured on a huge mass of them, and they would be dried into raisins and eaten throughout the winter months. You could also take grapes, and indeed this is done still in Bedouin cultures today, and boil them down and make kind of a grape molasses that you eat with the bread. And finally, there's wine. And even wine, as we think about it as a luxury good, wine was one of the few things that was drinkable and was safe. And while it was intoxicating in the form that we know it, it was oftentimes watered down, or actually really more like the water had a portion of wine added to it so that antimicrobial effects could take place. This was an essential good. And so as such, the way that vineyards were treated in the ancient world was as if they were essential goods. That's why we've got a watchtower here, for instance. The watchtower, you might think, it's to keep people from coming in and plundering the vineyard. Well, yes and no. I mean, yes, in terms of it was considered illegal for somebody to enter into a vineyard with something to carry grapes, either a pole or a bowl or anything like that, and to just start filling up their vase with grapes and walking off with that. That's plundering the vineyard. You didn't plant it. You didn't do that. You don't deserve that. But it's also fair to say that there was structures allowed within the system of law to provide for the very essential nature of this food product. So the people who wandered onto the vineyard who did not have something, but nevertheless were eating the grapes, that was allowed. And I think you can probably imagine in a fairly arid climate, if you are sojourning through an area and you're out of provisions and you're thirsty, or maybe you're next to dying, to come across a vineyard and be able to just enjoy the grapes could be the difference between life and death. And so Jewish law provided for that as well. And I think we can see some fairly clear parallels here, first of all. If the world is a vineyard, and if the idea of a vineyard is to produce fruit, and why don't we talk about what that fruit is in a second, then the lawful and fair distribution of those things is something that God has provided for. God built the structures around the place. God fenced it in, protected it, and built out all these laws. And in our world today, there are people who are showing up in the vineyard with big, big bowls. They're plucking grapes of neediness away from those people who truly do need them and walking away with them. And I want to put a fine point on that because it's too easy for us just to see people who plunder the vineyard and take from this world's wealth in a way that doesn't put a human face on it. But in the ancient world, that would have meant the difference between a widow's last meal. That would have been the very thing that kept an orphan from having to beg that day. Or, as I said before, a sojourner from dying on the road of thirst. These are specific people who would have been harmed by that act. And nevertheless, the vineyard also is a place of abundance. It's a place that will always have enough to take care of the truly needy. And again, I have to tell you that there are those people in this world today who have not known the world to be a place of abundance. And not because it's not because God made some mistake or put too little resources on this planet to sustain everyone. No, it's because we have sequestered it off and maybe by our plunder, we've not made it so that the very most needful people have had that grape when they need it most. And again, what grapes are these? What is the fruit that we're talking about? It's not always material. It's not always just the simple human necessities. Because human necessities, the way that the Bible understands it, the way that God understands it, is that we would be full, whole humans living in a whole creation. So our needs aren't just bread and water, but also justice and faith and hope. And there are people who have been marching in the streets now for month after month, looking for just a morsel of hope, looking for just a grape of justice. Just the hope, at least, that in our own homes, we wouldn't be shot at by a police force without a warrant. That is, if that's too much to ask, then something is truly wrong with the way we're treating God's vineyard. And maybe we, like the tenants, have forgotten whose vineyard it even is and under whose law it stands. But here's why the Pharisees are taking such an issue with this, is first of all, they don't believe they've been fundamentally unfair. And if people were to say, well, they've certainly benefited from their position, they've become quite wealthy and powerful, I don't think that that's Jesus' problem with them either. They are entitled, as tenants would be, to a certain fee that goes along with this. Indeed, in the ancient world, 50% of the harvest went to the tenant who was living there commonly. That's a huge, huge thing. they should know that they've been put into an incredibly generous position by being tenants. It seems to me that actually what Christ is saying is that the fruits of the kingdom are the fruits of grace. That grace, hope, faith, love, all of those things that Paul talks about, that is what we have been growing this entire time. And I think that the Pharisees have mistaken what they are doing, which is oftentimes a fulfillment of the law, but a fairly empty fulfillment of the law. One that obliges the letter, but persists with the idea that maybe there is no justice fundamentally for the orphan, that maybe there is no hope for the widow, and that ultimately God's reign becomes this sterile thing to them. What Jesus is saying instead is that you are thinking too small, you are too greedy and too obliged to your own way of thinking things. You need to remember to whom the vineyard belongs and for what it exists, why the world is here. Because the world exists for humans to find God in it, that we would walk in the vineyard with our Creator and have a wonderful, loving relationship with Him, individually, communally, in booths, eating grapes, some dried, some with bread. No matter what, it's supposed to be a feast, it's supposed to be a joy, and that we are called to do that by God and given such an enormously good place to do it within. That we would choose to be miserable, that we would choose to allow injustice to rule this vineyard is one of the saddest things that I think God could ever conceptualize of. And so Christ, in this passage, fully knowing and fully recognizing that he would die, goes into the vineyard nevertheless, knowing that he will be cast out of the vineyard by the end of it and cut off from the good creation by death, by his descent to the dead. But it's a price that he was willing to pay, that we all might renew our connection with this kingdom of heaven unfolding in the midst of the vineyard, bringing heaven and earth together again in wholeness. And may the words of Isaiah ring true for us again, where the lion and the lamb lie down, where this vineyard of plenty is replenished, and where we are brought together as a whole and just community in the midst of God's good creation with him forever and ever. Amen.